You don't belong in this ER, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez said loud enough for the entire trauma bay to hear. He snatched the chart right out of Sarah Chen's hands without looking at her once. 2 years. 2 years and you still can't read a basic EKG without holding someone's hand. Go change bedpans. That's your speed. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The nurses stared at the floor. The paramedics pretended to check their equipment. And Sarah Chen stood there 26 years old, her hands empty, her face burning, while the chief of trauma surgery walked away laughing. That moment right there, that is where this story begins. And I promise you before it ends, everything you think you know about who saves who is going to change completely. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every single word of this matters. Sarah Chen had learned early in life that the best thing a person could do when someone tried to make them small was to keep working, not argue, not cry in the supply closet, though she had done that too once in her first month at St. Catherine's. Not complain to HR because she had watched two other nurses do exactly that and come back to find their schedules rearranged into the worst possible shifts with the least possible support. She had learned to keep her head down, her hands busy, and her eyes open. So when Dr. Marcus Rodriguez pulled that chart out of her grip in front of 6 other people and told her to go change bedpans, Sarah Chen did not say a single word back. She walked to the supply station, picked up a fresh set of gloves, and went back to work. That was a Tuesday night in February, and the temperature outside had dropped to 11 degrees, which in Chicago meant the ER was going to be crowded and ugly and long. Cold weather pushed people indoors, and indoors pushed them into bad decisions. And bad decisions found their way to St. Catherine's emergency room on the northwest side of the city, where the night shift ran from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning, and the staff moved like people who had forgotten what it felt like to not be tired. Sarah had been working nights for 14 months. She had requested the shift herself, which surprised her supervisor at the time, a heavy-set woman named Diane, who had been at St. Catherine's for 22 years, and had seen enough young nurses burn out on days to be openly skeptical. Days are chaos, but nights will hollow you out, Diane had said. You sure about this? Sarah had said she was sure. What she hadn't said, because it was nobody's business, was that she preferred the night because the night was honest. There was no performance on the night shift, no administrators walking the floor, no visiting doctors trying to impress each other. On nights, what mattered was what you could actually do. What Sarah could actually do was considerable, though she would not have said that out loud to anyone at St. Catherine's. She had graduated top of her nursing class at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She had completed a clinical rotation in the cardiac ICU that her supervising physician had described in writing as the most technically precise he had seen from a student nurse in 15 years. She had a natural instinct for pattern recognition, the kind that could not be taught, only developed, and she had developed it fast. She noticed things, small things. The way a patient's left hand trembled slightly differently than the right, the way a man's breathing changed when he was lying about his pain level, the way a woman's eyes moved to the corner of the room when she said she had fallen down the stairs on her own. None of that mattered to Dr. Marcus Rodriguez. What mattered to Rodriguez was the hierarchy, and in that hierarchy, a 26-year-old nurse with 2 years of experience occupied a position somewhere between inconvenient and invisible. Rodriguez was 51 years old, chief of trauma surgery for 4 years, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his professional life been told he was wrong by someone he respected. He was not cruel the way some people are cruel with intention and pleasure. He was cruel the way a very large machine is cruel, not because it wants to hurt you, but because it is simply too big to notice you are there. He had singled Sarah out 8 months ago, and she had never been able to identify exactly why. Maybe it was the way she had questioned his medication order for a 14-year-old boy who had come in with a sports injury, politely professionally citing the patient's documented allergy right there in the chart. The order had been wrong. Rodriguez had corrected it without acknowledging her, and from that night forward, she had become a target. Chen. He would say her name like it was a punchline. Chen, did you actually go to nursing school or did you just watch a lot of medical dramas? Chen, I've seen high school students start IVs faster than you. Chen, next time you have a thought about my patient's treatment plan, write it on a piece of paper and then throw the paper away. She heard it so often that some nights she could recite his insults in advance, like a script she had memorized against her will. And the worst part, the part she would not admit to anyone, not even to her closest friend Yolanda, who worked labor and delivery on the fourth floor, was that it had started to work. Not in the way Rodriguez probably intended. She had not started to doubt her clinical judgment, but she had started to hesitate. A half-second pause before she spoke. A quick internal review before she acted. A breath she did not used to need before she walked into a room. That hesitation cost her nothing most nights. But in an emergency room, a hesitation is a debt that eventually comes due. The night Frank Morrison arrived, the ER was already running at 90% capacity. There had been a 3-car accident on the expressway that had sent 4 people in within the first hour of Sarah's shift. There was a 9-year-old girl in base 6 with a fever of 104 that had not responded to the first round of treatment and whose mother had not stopped crying since they arrived. There was a man in the waiting room, security had already been called twice, who was insisting that his stomach pain was being deliberately ignored because of his insurance status. And he was not entirely wrong about the waiting time, though the reason was volume, not malice. It was that kind of night. Frank Morrison walked in under his own power, which was the first thing Sarah noticed about him. In the ER, the ones who walked in under their own power were the ones you had to watch the most carefully because they had often spent hours convincing themselves they didn't need to be there. And by the time they arrived, the problem had been building quietly for longer than anyone knew. He was tall, even with the slight forward lean of a man in his mid-70s who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He had white hair cut close to his scalp, a jaw that looked like it had been set in place by someone who didn't compromise, and eyes the color of old pewter. He was wearing a Korean War veteran's jacket over a flannel shirt, and he was holding his left arm close to his body in a way that he probably thought looked casual, but did not look casual at all. He told the intake nurse his name was Frank Morrison, that he was 74 years old, and that he had some chest tightness that was probably nothing. He listed his medications from memory without being asked: a beta blocker, a blood thinner, a statin, a low-dose aspirin. The intake nurse flagged him as cardiac protocol and put him in Bay 3, which was Sarah's bay. Sarah came in, looked at him once, and felt something tighten in her own chest. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I'm Sarah Chen. I'll be your nurse tonight. I need you to tell me exactly what you're feeling, and I need you to not minimize it." He looked at her with those pewter eyes, and something crossed his face that might have been amusement. "You get a lot of minimizers in here. The ones who walk themselves in are usually the worst," she said. "On a scale of 1 to 10, your chest pain." 4, and he said without hesitation. "When you're alone at home and nobody's asking what number is it." He paused. She watched his jaw move slightly, like he was testing the words before he let them out. 6, he said. "Maybe 6.5. "How long?" "Owen started about 2 hours ago. Came and went for the first hour. Steadier now." "Any radiation to your arm, your jaw, your back?" "Little bit of shoulder, left side." Sarah reached for the cardiac monitor leads and began attaching them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it enough times that her hands and her brain were running separate tracks. Her hands were working. Her brain was already calculating. The left shoulder radiation combined with the beta blocker on his list and the particular way he was holding his left arm and the fact that he had waited 2 hours before coming in, none of it was good. "Have you had angina before, Mr. Morrison?" "Had a stent put in 4 years ago," he said. "Cardiac event 3 years before that. I know what angina feels like. This is different." "Different how?" He thought about it. "The other times it went away when I sat down and rested. This one keeps coming back even when I'm not moving. Unstable angina." The words clicked into place in Sarah's mind with the quiet certainty of a diagnosis that doesn't need to argue with itself. Unstable angina was not a heart attack, not yet, but it was the warning that a heart attack was in the staging area, putting on its coat, getting ready to walk out the door. The treatment window was not infinite. The treatment window was in fact right now. She called for an EKG machine. She drew blood for troponin levels and BMP without waiting to be told. She started a saline lock on his right arm and hung a nitroglycerin drip at the lowest therapeutic dose because his blood pressure was borderline and she was not going to blow it out by pushing too hard. She did all of this in 11 minutes, which was fast, and she knew it was fast, and she did not allow herself to feel good about knowing it. "You're very efficient," Frank said, watching her. "I try to be." "Young," he said, not unkindly, just observationally, the way a man who has been around a long time sometimes states facts that other people might find impolite. 26, she said. "My granddaughter is 26. Is she?" "She's an attorney," he said. "Corporate law, very impressive." He paused. "You're more impressive." Sarah looked up from the IV line. "I haven't done anything impressive yet. I've just done my job." "That's what impressive looks like when it's real," Frank Morrison said. And then he winced and his right hand moved to press flat against his sternum, and Sarah was already reaching for the call button before he got the words out. "There it is again," he said. His voice was completely steady, and Sarah realized with a cold clarity that this man had spent decades training himself to keep his voice steady when his body was in pain, and that particular skill was now actively working against her ability to assess him accurately. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to stop being brave for the next hour," she said. "I know that's probably not something anyone's asked you before, but your bravery is making it harder for me to help you. Every time the pain gets worse, I need to know. Every time something changes, I need to know. Can you do that for me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "My wife used to say something like that," he said. "She said my biggest problem was that I'd spent so long being tough that I'd forgotten how to be honest about being hurt." "She sounds like a smart woman." "Smartest person I ever knew," he said. And then quietly, "She died 6 years ago." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. And she meant it the way you mean things when you're too tired and too busy to pretend, when the standard sympathies have been used up, and what comes out is just the actual truth of how you feel. "It's all right," he said. "And then the pain is a 7. I want you to write that down. 7. She wrote it down. She was still writing when Rodriguez walked into Bay 3. He was not there for Frank. He was passing through, heading toward Bay 5 where the accident victims were, and he stopped when he saw Sarah adjusting the nitroglycerin drip. He stopped, and he looked at the medication bag, and he looked at the monitoring leads, and he looked at Sarah with an expression that managed to communicate a great deal without saying anything at all. "Who ordered the nitro drip?" he said. "I initiated the protocol based on presentation," Sarah said. "He meets the criteria for unstable angina. Chest pain with radiation not responsive to rest history of cardiac events, current cardiac medications." "You initiated the protocol," Rodriguez repeated. He said it slowly, the way someone might repeat back a statement that contained an absurdity so obvious it didn't need to be pointed out directly. "I was about to page cardiology by Earth," Sarah said. "I wanted the drip started before you wanted," Rodriguez said. "What I want, Chen, is for nurses on this floor to follow established procedure, which includes getting a physician to sign off before initiating drip therapy. What I want is to not walk through this ER and find a second-year nurse playing doctor, because she thinks she knows better than the protocols that exist for a reason." The bay was not large. Frank Morrison was in the bed not 4 feet away, hearing every word. "The protocols exist to protect patients," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "The protocols also allow for nurse-initiated cardiac protocol in time-sensitive presentations when a physician is not immediately available. I documented everything. The time of onset, my assessment, the criteria I used." "I am immediately available," Rodriguez said. "I was 20 feet away." "You were with trauma patients," Sarah said. "I made a judgment call." "You made a judgment call," Rodriguez repeated again, with that same measured repetition that was somehow worse than shouting. "Let me tell you something about judgment calls, Chen. Judgment calls are made by people with enough experience to know the difference between what they think they know and what they actually know. You have been a nurse for 2 years. You have been a nurse in this ER for 14 months. You do not yet have the foundation to be making judgment calls on drip therapy for cardiac patients, and the fact that you think you do is exactly the kind of dangerous overconfidence that gets people killed." The word "killed" landed in the room and stayed there. Frank Morrison's voice came from the bed, completely unhurried, the voice of a man who had been in rooms where people were angry and had a very clear internal measurement for what kind of angry actually mattered. "Excuse me," he said. Rodriguez looked at him, visibly recalibrating his expression from administrator to physician. "Mr. Morrison, I apologize for the disruption. I'm Dr. Rodriguez, Chief of Trauma Surgery. I want to assure you that we're going to take excellent care of—" "I wasn't talking to you," Frank said. He was looking at Sarah. "I was talking to her." He turned back to Rodriguez. "I want to be clear about something. This nurse came in, assessed me, recognized what was happening with me faster than I've been recognized in 4 previous hospital visits over the past 7 years, and started a treatment that for the first time in the past 2 hours has made the pain in my chest start to back down. I don't know what kind of argument the two of you are having or what history there is between you, but I am a patient in this bed, and I am telling you as directly as I can that this nurse made the right call." He paused. "I did 31 years in the United States Army. I know the difference between someone following a protocol and someone actually thinking. She was thinking, and that matters." Rodriguez looked at Frank Morrison for a moment. With an expression that was difficult to read, he looked at Sarah. He looked at the chart in his hand that he hadn't been carrying when he came in, and then he realized he wasn't holding any chart at all. He had walked in empty-handed, which meant he had walked in specifically to address what he'd seen, which meant he had no clinical reason to be in this bay at all. "I'll have cardiology paged," Rodriguez said, and his voice had changed in some small way that wasn't an apology and wasn't an acknowledgement, but was the slightest possible retreat from where he had been standing. He walked out without another word. The bay was quiet. "Thank you," Sarah said to Frank Morrison. She said it very quietly. "Don't thank me," he said. "You were right. I was just making sure the record was clear." He paused. "In the Army, we called it establishing the ground truth, getting the facts on the table before someone with more rank than sense starts rewriting history." Sarah allowed herself for just a moment to smile. "That's a good way to put it." "Does he do that a lot?" Frank asked. Not angry, just asking. "More than he should," Sarah said. "Have you ever reported it?" "I've considered it." "Considering isn't the same as doing," Frank said. "Not critically, just factually. The way people who have learned things the hard way state the lessons without dressing them up." "No," Sarah agreed. "It isn't." The cardiology resident arrived 14 minutes later. Reviewed Sarah's documentation, reviewed the EKG she had run, looked at the troponin results that had come back from the lab, and told Frank Morrison that he was being admitted to the cardiac care unit immediately, and that the nurse who had been treating him had caught something that another 20 minutes would have turned into a significantly more serious situation. He said this matter-of-factly, the way residents say things when they have not yet learned the political calculations that come with more senior positions. Frank Morrison looked at Sarah when the resident said that. He looked at her and he nodded once slowly, the way a person nods when something they already knew has been confirmed. "I'll be back to check on you before you transfer," Sarah told him. "I know you will," he said. And then as she was turning to leave, "Chen, what does that name come from?" "My grandparents were from Shanghai," she said. "My parents were born in California. I was born here." "Chicago girl," he said. "Through and through," she said. She left Bay 3 and walked back into the controlled chaos of the ER, back into the noise and the fluorescent light, and the particular smell of the night shift that was equal parts antiseptic and exhaustion, and she did not think about Rodriguez again for the next 4 hours. She had 12 other patients to attend to, and a 9-year-old with a fever that still hadn't broken, and a man in the waiting room who was now threatening to call a city councilman and a paramedic crew that had just radioed ahead about a possible overdose coming in from the west side in approximately 8 minutes. She thought about Frank Morrison once briefly when the cardiac unit called down to confirm his transfer, and the charge nurse on the unit said, "Whoever your nurse was, she caught this early. He's going to be fine." Sarah marked it in the chart and moved on. What she did not know and would not know until much later was that Frank Morrison did not transfer quietly. He transferred slowly, asking questions at every stage, and one of the questions he asked the cardiology resident was the full name of the nurse who had treated him in Bay 3, and the resident told him. Sarah Chen did not go home when her shift ended at 7. She sat in the break room for 20 minutes drinking bad coffee and letting the silence of the morning hour work its way into her before she changed out of her scrubs. She had been awake for 22 hours. She had treated 31 patients over the course of the night. She had been publicly humiliated once defended unexpectedly by a stranger and confirmed by cardiology in a clinical judgment that her chief of surgery had called dangerous overconfidence. She sat with all of that. She turned it over slowly the way you turn over something heavy to check what's underneath. The coffee was terrible. The break room smelled like someone had microwaved fish sometime in the past century, and the ghost of it had never fully left. The fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly in a specific frequency that she had counted once during a long night and determined came out to approximately 53 cycles per minute. She thought about her grandmother, who had come to this country with 2 suitcases and a daughter who was 6 months old and not a word of English, and had worked in a restaurant kitchen for 11 years before she could afford to take one class at community college, and then another class, and then another, and who had told Sarah when Sarah was 10 years old that the only people worth being afraid of were the ones who tried to make you feel small, because that was the only weapon they had. She thought about Frank Morrison saying, "I know the difference between someone following a protocol and someone actually thinking." She finished her coffee. She changed out of her scrubs. She took the bus home through the cold, gray Chicago morning with her bag on her lap and her eyes halfway closed. And she did not know as the bus moved through the West Side streets that in approximately 18 hours, she would be back inside St. Catherine's ER. She did not know that the night she was about to sleep through would be the last ordinary night of her life. She did not know that the man in the cardiac unit with the pewter eyes and the Korean war jacket would become the reason that everything she had worked for and everything she had endured and every moment she had swallowed her pride and kept her hands moving and her head down was about to be tested in a way that no amount of training, no amount of clinical skill, and no amount of quiet determination could have prepared her for. She fell asleep before her stop and woke up 2 blocks past it and had to walk back in the cold. And even that felt like Chicago telling her something. Every day here asked something of you. Every single day, this city required you to show up and keep moving. And Sarah Chen, 26 years old, daughter of a California family, granddaughter of Shanghai night nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital on the Northwest Side, kept moving. She had always kept moving. She just didn't know yet what she was moving toward. She slept 9 hours, which was 2 more than usual, and woke up feeling like she had been wrung out and hung to dry over something cold. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Kedzie Avenue that had good bones and bad windows, and the February wind came through the frames at night with the kind of persistence that suggested it had nowhere else to be. She lay there for a few minutes in the gray afternoon light, listening to the radiator knock and hiss, and she thought about Frank Morrison. Not about his case specifically. She had a clinical memory that compartmentalized well-filed things in their correct drawers and closed them. She thought about the way he had spoken to Rodriguez, the absolute calm of it, the precision. 31 years in the Army, and he had walked into a confrontation between 2 people he had met a combined total of 40 minutes ago, and he had laid out the facts like a man who had been in rooms where the stakes were actual life and death, and understood at a bone-deep level that most arguments people thought were important simply were not. She thought about what he had said when she left. Chicago girl, the way he had said it like it meant something, like it was a designation that carried weight. She got up, made coffee that was better than the break room variety, but still not good, at half a piece of toast standing over the sink, and began getting ready for her shift. She was back at St. Catherine's by 6:45. Diane was at the nurse's station when Sarah came in, which was unusual because Diane normally left by 6. She was standing at the desk with a look on her face that said she had information she was not entirely sure what to do with. "Your cardiac admit from last night," Diane said without preamble. "Morrison," Sarah said, reaching for her assignment sheet. "He's been asking about you." Sarah looked up. "Asking what?" "Asking when you come back on. Asking if you could come up to see him before your shift. Asking, and this is my personal favorite, whether there was a formal process for commending a nurse's performance or whether he should just write a letter." Sarah set down the assignment sheet. "He asked that 3 separate times," Diane said. "The cardiac unit charge nurse called down here personally. I think she was a little charmed." Diane paused. "I think she was also a little confused because she said the patient seemed very calm about being in the hospital, like he'd been in worse places and wanted everyone to know it without actually saying so." "That tracks," Sarah said. "Rodriguez also called down this morning," Diane said, and her voice changed on the name, the way everyone's voice changed on that name, a slight tightening, a careful neutrality. He reviewed your charting from last night on the Morrison case. Sarah waited. He didn't say anything specific, Diane said. He just called and asked to have the chart sent to him. That's all. That's enough, Sarah said. Yeah, Diane said. It is. Sarah went upstairs to the cardiac unit before her shift started. She had 8 minutes, which was not enough time for a real visit, but was enough time to check in to see for herself that he was stable to close the loop that her clinical instincts had been leaving open since she'd gotten on the bus that morning. Frank Morrison was in room 411. He was sitting up in the bed in a hospital gown that he wore with the resigned dignity of a man who had put on enough uncomfortable uniforms in his life to have made a philosophical peace with clothing that didn't fit. There was a monitor above him tracing his heart rhythm in green peaks and valleys, and there was a family photo on the rolling table beside him that had not been there the night before, which meant someone had brought it. The photo showed a younger Frank with a woman who must have been his wife and 2 children who were clearly in their teens. His wife had a wide smile and her hand on his arm, and she was looking not at the camera, but at him. Sarah did not comment on the photo. Instead, she said, "How are you feeling?" "Better than last night," he said. "Worse than I'd like." He looked at her. "You look like you slept." "I did. That's unusual, so I'm trying to enjoy it." He smiled at that. It changed his face considerably. "They tell me they want to do an angiogram tomorrow," he said. "See if the stent is still doing what it's supposed to be doing." "That's the right call," Sarah said. "With your presentation and the troponin levels, they need a clear picture." "They also told me," Frank said, and his voice got the slightly careful quality of a man who was about to say something he had prepared, "that your initial treatment was precisely correct, that starting the nitro when you did likely prevented a full coronary event." He let that sit for a moment. The cardiologist said it with the kind of tone that suggested she thought someone else might have told me the opposite. Sarah said nothing. "I've been in long enough to know what someone else told you the opposite looks like on a person," Frank said. "What happened this morning after I transferred?" "Nothing I can't handle," Sarah said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. In 26 years, she had met very few people who asked questions the way he did, not as a preamble to giving their own opinion, but as a genuine request for information. She had noticed it the night before, and she was noticing it again now. He asked, and then he waited, and he did not fill the silence with anything which was a more sophisticated conversational skill than most people realized. "He reviewed my charting," she said. "That's all so far." "Looking for something to criticize?" "Possibly." "Will he find it?" "No," Sarah said. "He won't." Frank nodded. "You're sure of your work?" "I'm sure of that chart." "That's not the same thing." She paused. "You're right. It's not, but it's what I can control." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What can't you control?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the monitor above him, at the green line of his heartbeat moving steady and regular across the screen, and she thought about how to answer honestly without oversharing, without handing her professional vulnerability to a patient she had known for less than 12 hours. However much she had already, in some way she couldn't fully account for, come to trust this man. "His perception of me," she finally said. "He's decided what I am. Evidence to the contrary doesn't interest him." Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular weight of someone choosing words that have been tested by experience rather than borrowed from advice. "I had a commanding officer like that," he said. "Fort Bragg, 1971. He had decided that I was a problem before I had done a single thing to earn it, and I spent 8 months trying to change his mind by being perfect." He paused. "It didn't work." "What did?" "I stopped trying to change his mind," Frank said. "I stopped performing for him. I just did the work, and I let the work be whatever it was." He looked at her steadily. Eventually, the work spoke loud enough that his opinion became irrelevant. Sarah heard it. She heard it all the way down to the place where she kept the things she didn't say out loud. "How long did it eventually take?" Frank Morrison looked at her with those pewter eyes and said, "Longer than it should have, but shorter than it felt while it was happening." He reached out and put his hand briefly on the rail of the bed, a gesture that was almost like he would have put it on her arm if that had been appropriate. "You caught something last night that bought me time I didn't know I was running out of. Whatever that man says about you, whatever he does with your chart, that is a fact that exists in the world now and cannot be undone." Sarah nodded. I have to go, she said. My shift starts in 3 minutes. I know, he said. Come back if you can. I will, she said. She meant it. She did not know, walking back to the elevator, that she was not going to make it back to room 411 that night, under any circumstances she would have chosen. The ER at 7 in the evening was in the particular state that experienced nurses called the hinge, the point in the shift when the day's unresolved cases were handing off to the night's incoming chaos, when the waiting room had been building for 2 hours and the incoming shift was still getting its bearings, and the entire department was stretched between what was already happening and what was about to. Sarah walked into it like someone who had been walking into it for 14 months. Read the board took her assignments and started moving. Rodriguez was not on the floor for the first 2 hours, which was a small mercy. The ER was short-staffed. A nurse named Priya had called in sick, and they had not been able to pull a replacement from anywhere, which meant Sarah and a nurse named Danny Torres were each running a load that was meant for 2 people. Danny was 38, 12 years in, and one of the people Sarah genuinely liked in this building. He was a big man with a bald head and a laugh that belonged in a larger room, and a clinical instinct that he consistently undersold because he had learned over 12 years that overselling your instincts in this ER attracted the wrong kind of attention. Short again, he said to her, not as a complaint, just as an acknowledgement of terrain. Short again, she agreed. Rodriguez coming in late, Danny said. He's covering a presentation somewhere downtown. Somebody else's problem till 10. Somebody else's problem till 10. Sarah repeated with a feeling that was not joy exactly, but was the relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told they can set it down for a few hours. They moved. The ER moved with them. A 12-year-old with a broken wrist from a school fight, a 63-year-old woman presenting with a TIA, the transient ischemic attack that people called a mini-stroke, and that Sarah had been trained to call a warning and treat accordingly. An elderly man who had been brought in by his daughter after a fall at home and who kept asking for someone named Gloria, who turned out to be his wife and who the daughter quietly told Sarah had died 2 years ago. Sarah sat with that one for 2 full minutes that she did not have, because the man's face when he asked for Gloria was the face of someone whose grief was so complete and so current that it did not know about the 2 years at all, and she could not simply move on from it. Danny caught her eye across the bay when she finally stepped out. He had seen the 2 minutes. He didn't say anything. He nodded. That was the thing about Danny Torres. He understood what it cost the 2 minutes, and he never once made her feel like the pay was unjustified. At 9:40, the board was fuller than it had been at the start of the shift, which was not supposed to be possible, but was routinely possible at a St. Catherine's. Sarah was between patients, standing at the nurse's station, updating a chart, when she heard the waiting room get louder in a specific way. Not the random escalation of people who had been waiting too long. Something different. Something that had a direction to it. She looked up. Danny was already looking toward the waiting room. He had his head slightly tilted the way a person tilts their head when they're listening for something that isn't the obvious noise. You hear that? He said. Yeah, she said. The noise crested, and then suddenly it stopped. Not the way noise stops when something gets resolved. The way noise stops when something new has entered the room and changed the nature of all the calculations being made. The double doors from the waiting room swung open. 3 men came through. They were moving with the specific purposefulness of people who had decided something before they came in and had no remaining uncertainty about the decision. 2 of them had their hands in the front pockets of their jackets, and the third one had his right hand already out. And Sarah could see what was in it before her mind had fully registered what she was seeing. The man in front said one thing. He said it loudly, and he said it once. Everybody on the ground. The ER did not freeze the way it freezes in movies. It fragmented. A tray went down somewhere to the left. Someone screamed short and sharp and then cut off. A monitor alarm somewhere started blaring at the exact wrong moment, and then someone hit the silence. And the silence was somehow worse than the alarm. A paramedic who had been standing near the door dropped flat immediately with the instinctive compliance of someone who had been trained to assess threat and neutralize themselves as a variable. A doctor near Bay 2 went down on one knee and then the other hands rising. Danny Torres said very quietly directly into Sarah's ear because she was standing right next to him and neither of them had moved yet. Don't run. I know, she said. Get down slow. She was already processing, not panicking, not freezing, processing. There were 11 patients currently in bays. 7 of them were in beds and could not get to the floor without falling. 3 of the men were near the entrance, which meant they were between the ER and the exit. The security desk near the front had 1 officer on duty at this hour, and she could not see him, which meant he had either gone to the floor or he had made another decision that she did not have time to evaluate. The second man had moved to the center of the room and his jacket was open now, and Sarah could see the gun at his waist, the kind that was visible because it was meant to be visible. Control through visibility. She had read about this in a training she had done 18 months ago on active threat response, a 4-hour Saturday session that most of the staff had treated as a formality. Sarah had taken 6 pages of notes. The third man turned and put his back to the wall beside the entrance doors, watching both directions. What do you want? A voice said from somewhere behind Sarah. She did not turn to find it. She recognized it as belonging to one of the ER attending's doctor. Kim, a woman in her 40s who had the particular calm of someone who operated in emergencies for a living and had apparently decided that asking a direct question was preferable to waiting. The man in front turned toward Dr. Kim's voice. We want the man on the 4th floor, he said. The one who came in last night. Morrison. Sarah's blood did something cold and definitive inside her veins. She heard it twice in her mind. The one who came in last night. Morrison. Frank Morrison. Room 411, the cardiac unit. The angiogram tomorrow morning. The photo of his wife on the rolling table. I don't know who you mean, Tame, Dr. Kim said. The man took 3 steps forward, and Sarah could hear the shift in the room that his 3 steps created, the collective inhalation, the compression of breath, and then he said, we don't need you to know who we mean. We need you to call upstairs and tell them to bring him down. This is an emergency room, Dr. Kim said. We don't call upstairs, the man said. Right now. Danny Torres, flat on the floor 3 feet from Sarah, turned his head toward her without lifting it and mouthed one word. She read it clearly. She had been reading Danny's mouth across crowded ER bays for 14 months. Run. She did not run. Her mind was moving through the layout of the hospital, through what she knew about the cardiac unit, through the specific fact that Frank Morrison's angiogram was scheduled for 6 in the morning, which meant the cardiac unit overnight staff was running light, which meant the 3 men in this ER had almost certainly calculated the same thing she was now calculating. The 4th floor was accessible from 2 elevators and 1 stairwell on this side of the building, and the secondary stairwell near the chapel on the west wing. If no one on the 4th floor knew what was happening in the ER right now, they were accessible. They were reachable. She looked at the phone on the nurse's station counter. It was approximately 12 feet from where she was crouching behind the station. The cardiac unit extension was 447. She had called it 14 times in the past 2 months and had the number in her hands-free memory, the way you have numbers you use without thinking about using them. The man who had spoken was facing Dr. Kim. The man in the center of the room was facing the bays. The man at the door was watching the entrance. Nobody was watching the nurse's station. Sarah moved. She moved low and fast, the way she had moved 1,000 times in a small apartment, with a younger brother who treated the living room floor as a wrestling mat the way she had moved in the 3 years she had spent training in judo at a community gym 3 blocks from her parents' house in Bridgeport. Not gracefully, practically. She covered the 12 feet in under 3 seconds, came up behind the counter, and had the phone in her hand before the man at the door had finished his sweep back toward the interior. She pressed 447. It rang twice, 3 times. And Sarah Chen crouched behind the nurse's station counter with a phone pressed against her ear and 3 armed men 20 feet away, and her heart running at a rate she could have calculated to the beat per minute if she'd had the cognitive bandwidth to spare, said the most important thing she had ever said in a professional capacity in her life. This is Chen from the ER, she said in a voice that was just loud enough to be heard by whoever answered, and just quiet enough to not be heard by the men in the room. We have an armed intrusion. They're asking for Frank Morrison. Lock the unit. Do not let anyone in or out. Call 911 if you haven't already. Lock the unit now. A voice on the other end said something she couldn't fully hear. She said, "Now one more time and put the phone down." She turned. The man at the door was looking directly at her. For one full second, neither of them moved. Sarah was behind the counter and still crouched the phone back on its cradle, and the man at the door had his weapon no longer in his waistband, but in his hand, and she could see clearly from his posture that the calculation he was making about her was moving very quickly toward a conclusion she did not want him to reach. She stood up slowly. She put her hands out, palms forward, where he could see them. She said, "I'm a nurse. I'm not going anywhere." He stared at her for what felt like a year but was approximately 4 seconds, and then the man in the center of the room said, "Leave her." And the man at the door moved his eyes away from her and swept back to the entrance. Sarah breathed. Danny Torres from the floor was looking up at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. She had seen Danny Torres handle a man twice his size who had come in swinging. She had seen him work a code blue without raising his voice. She had never seen him look afraid. He was looking afraid now, not for himself, for her. She shook her head at him, a small movement that meant, "I'm okay." He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he gave her a look that meant something she could not immediately translate. She translated it later in the weeks that followed, and what it meant was, "You have no idea what you just did." She didn't know yet. She was still doing it. The man in front had gotten on his own phone now, speaking in a low voice, and she could not hear what he was saying, but she could read his posture, and his posture said that something had not gone according to the plan he had arrived with. Something had changed. Something upstairs had changed, because someone had answered the phone. Sarah Chen was still standing at the nurse's station, hands visible, breathing through the controlled rhythm she had learned in the judo gym. At 17 years old, 4 counts in 4 counts, hold 4 counts out, and she was keeping her face completely neutral, and inside that neutral face her mind was doing the one thing it had always done better than anything else. It was thinking. The man in front finished his call, and the change in him was immediate and physical, the way a temperature changes physical, you feel it before you can name it. He turned to the man in the center of the room and said 2 words that Sarah could not hear, and the man in the center nodded once with a tight, economical movement of someone receiving information they had already prepared for. Then the man in front looked at the room, at the people on the floor, at the nurses behind stations, and the doctors crouched beside beds, and his voice, when he spoke again, had lost whatever thin coating of control it had carried before. "Nobody called anybody," he said. "Nobody picked up any phones. If someone called upstairs, I'm going to know about it in about 30 seconds, and when I know about it, I'm going to walk through this room and figure out who it was." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed more than they had to. Danny Torres from the floor did not look at Sarah. He was very deliberate about not looking at Sarah, and she understood that his deliberateness was the most protective thing he could offer her right now. She had her hands visible. She had her face neutral. She had her breathing at 4 counts in 4 counts, whole 4 counts out, and she was standing behind the nurse's station counter, and she was thinking about what would happen in the next 60 seconds, because 60 seconds was the unit of time that mattered right now. Not the next hour, not the next 10 minutes. 60 seconds. The man's phone buzzed. He answered it. He listened for approximately 10 seconds. His jaw tightened in the particular way that jaws tighten when the news is bad and the person receiving it has no good options left. He put the phone back in his pocket. "Units locked," he said to the man in the center. Not surprised, just stating the new terrain. "Then we go up," the center man said. "Elevators locked out too. They've done a full lockdown." A beat, then stairs. "Cops are going to be here in 4 minutes," the man at the door said, and his voice had the brittle quality of someone who had just done a calculation that was not coming out the way he needed it to. The man in front said nothing for 3 full seconds. Sarah counted them. In those 3 seconds, she watched him think, and what she saw on his face was not the thinking of a man with a plan, but the thinking of a man whose plan had just collapsed and who was now constructing something new out of whatever was left. That was the most dangerous kind of thinking. Planned violence had a shape. Improvised violence had no shape at all. "We need somebody," he said, not to the room, to his people. "We need somebody they'll trade for." Sarah's hands were still out and visible. She kept them there. She kept her face the same. But inside the locked room of her own head, something had shifted into a different gear entirely. A gear she had not known she possessed until this moment. And what it felt like was not fear and not courage, but a pure, stripped-down clarity. The kind of clarity that she imagined existed at the bottom of very cold water. She was the only person in this room still standing. She understood exactly what that meant. The man in front turned and looked at her. He had been circling back to her since the moment his partner said leave her, and she had known he would. She had known it the way she knew when a patient's numbers were trending somewhere bad, not from any single data point, but from the pattern of all of them together. You, he said, come out from behind there. She came out from behind the counter. She moved the same way she had moved to get to the phone, not slowly, not rushing, just with the deliberate control of someone who understood that every movement she made right now was being read by 3 different people, and she could not afford to send the wrong message. She stood in the open floor of the ER with her hands at her sides. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she was wearing blue scrubs and a hospital ID badge, and she understood exactly what this man needed. And a body that wasn't a patient, a person who had already demonstrated that she was willing to move against a type which made her valuable and dangerous in equal measure. You made that call, he said. It was not a question. She said nothing. I know you made that call, he said. You're the only one who was standing. So here is what happens next. You're going to walk to that elevator with me. You're going to get me up to the 4th floor. And if the unit unlocks when you call up there, nobody in this room gets hurt. Dr. Kim's voice came from the floor behind and to Sarah's left. She's not going anywhere with you. The man turned toward the voice with a speed that was meant to frighten, and it worked because the room contracted around the movement. Sarah said, it's all right. A beat of silence. Then Dr. Kim said, Chen. It's all right, Sarah said again, and she put enough weight on it that Dr. Kim went quiet. Not because Sarah was pulling rank, because the tone she had used was the tone you use when you need someone to trust you without an explanation, and you are asking them to do it right now. She looked at the man in front. You're not going to get to the 4th floor, she said. The hospital's in full lockdown. That means every access point between here and that unit is controlled. The elevators are out. The stairwells on this side of the building will be secured within the next 2 minutes if they aren't already. The only thing you're going to find up those stairs is whatever's waiting for you at the top. He stared at her. I'm telling you this, she said, because you asked me to help you get up there, and I am telling you honestly that I cannot help you get up there. And I think part of you knows that your window for walking out of this building is closing, and it is closing right now. You don't tell me what my window is, he said. No, she said. You're right, I don't. She kept her hands still. She kept her voice level. But I have been standing in this room with you for the last several minutes, and I can read a room. And what I'm reading is that this was not supposed to go this way, and the people in this building are not the people you should be spending your time on. Something moved through his face, not softening, more like a small structural shift, the kind that happens when something true has landed in a place that was not prepared for it. He looked at her like she was a problem he did not have the correct tool to solve. Then his partner said, cops are here, and the temperature in the room dropped approximately 10 degrees in under a second. The man at the door had his back flat against the wall, and he was watching the entrance through the narrow window beside the frame, and his voice when he said it had the compressed quality of someone reporting information they were hoping not to have to report. The man in front turned away from Sarah. He looked at his partner in the center. He looked at the man at the door. Something was being decided, and it was being decided without words in the language of people who knew each other well enough that eye contact carried full sentences. Then everything happened very fast. The center man moved toward the patient bays. He moved toward Bay 3 specifically, which was the nearest occupied bay, and he grabbed the rail of the bed, and the man in Bay 3 was a 47-year-old with a suspected kidney stone who had been lying very still since the moment the men came through the doors, and he made a sound. Now that was not quite a word and not quite a scream. Nobody moves, the center man said, and his voice had dropped to something flat and technical, stripped of the performance of control, just the bare fact of it. Danny Torres moved. He came up from the floor, and he moved toward the center man, and he was fast for a big man, genuinely fast. But the center man had seen him move and turned with the gun coming up, and Danny stopped. He stopped with 3 feet between himself and the barrel, and he stood there with his hands rising and his chest heaving and his face carrying that particular devastated look of a person who has just discovered the exact location of the line they cannot cross. "Danny," Sarah said. One word. His name. He heard it. He stepped back. "Everybody stay where you are," the man in front said, and he was back to watching Sarah specifically. Sarah with the attention of a man who had identified the variable he could not predict. She was thinking about Bay 3. She was thinking about what was in Bay 3 and what was not in Bay 3, and whether the man with the kidney stone could tolerate what was coming, if what was coming was what she thought it was. She was thinking about the doors behind her, the ones that led to the ambulance bay, which were not locked because they could not be locked under fire code, which meant there was an exit within 60 feet of where she was standing. She was thinking about whether she could create enough noise, enough direction, enough distraction to give the people on the floor a window. She was thinking about all of it simultaneously in the way that her brain had always worked when the pressure was high enough, not in sequence, but in parallel. Everything running at once, waiting for the calculation to resolve. What she was not thinking about was herself. She would understand that later. She would understand it clearly and without sentimentality. In the moment that mattered, she had not thought about herself at all. It was not bravery. It was not heroism. It was what happened when the thing you had spent your entire adult life training for converged with the circumstances that required it, and the self simply stepped out of the way. She heard the door behind her, not the ambulance bay doors, a different door. The door at the far end of the ER that led to the service corridor, and it opened with the soft pressurized exhale of a fire door being pushed, which meant it had been opened from outside, which meant someone was coming in. The man at the front door heard it too. He turned. In the half second that he turned, Sarah moved to the left toward Bay 3, toward the man in the bed, not running, just moving, interposing herself between the bed and the center man's gun with the clean efficiency of someone who had made the decision before the moment arrived and was simply now executing it. The center man swung toward her and said, "Stop." She stopped. She was standing in front of the bed, between the gun and the patient. "Move," he said. "No." "Oh," she said. It was the quietest word she had ever said. It was the most complete word she had ever said. No preamble, no explanation, no negotiation behind it. Just the words standing alone the way she was standing alone. The room held its breath. Then two things happened simultaneously. The service corridor door opened fully, and a voice came through it. A voice that carried the particular authority of someone trained to project into a space and have the projection mean something. And what the voice said was, "Chicago PD, put the weapons down." And at the exact same moment, the center man took one step towards Sarah and his arm came up. She heard the shot before she felt it. That was the thing nobody told you. The sound arrived first, a flat declarative crack that seemed too small for what it was, too ordinary, like something that should have a bigger announcement attached to it. And then the impact arrived in her left shoulder, like something had swung a bat at full force, and she staggered, but she did not go down. She did not go down because the man in Bay 3 was directly behind her, and going down meant the angle changed, and she understood that with a clarity that overrode everything else. She put her right hand on the bed rail. She steadied herself. The room exploded, not an actual explosion, movement voices the thunder of boots from the service corridor. The center man took 2 steps back, swinging between the incoming officers and the woman who would not fall down, and his partner from the front was shouting something that Sarah could not parse because the shoulder was now reporting in with more information than she had bandwidth to process. The second shot hit her left side, between the ribs and the hip, not center mass low and to the left, and that one took her breath, the way being hit by a car takes your breath completely instantaneously, as though her lungs had simply decided to do something else entirely. She stayed on her feet. Her right hand was on the rail, and she was bending forward slightly at the waist, and her left hand had come up to press against her side without her directing it. Pure body response, and she could feel the warmth spreading under her palm, and she thought with strange clinical detachment that one hit something. Danny Torres was screaming her name. The officers were through the corridor door and through the ambulance bay simultaneously, and the room was full of voices and commands and the particular controlled chaos of a tactical entry into a space that had already cracked open. The man at the door went down to his knees with his hands rising and the words coming out of his mouth that people say when the calculation has finally resolved all the way to the bottom. The center man had 3 steps left to decide, and he made the wrong one, and then he made no more decisions. The man in front was the last one standing, and he looked at Sarah, and she looked back at him, and she could tell from his face that he was seeing something he had not expected to see. Not a hostage, not a shield. A person who had stood between him and what he wanted and was still standing. Then he put the gun on the floor. The third shot had not come from any of them. The third shot had come from a gun discharging during the takedown, the center man's weapon hitting the floor at angle that sent it firing into the wall, and the fragment of something tile metal she would never know exactly catching her in the left leg above the knee. She felt it as a deep burn rather than the sharp impact of the first 2, and by that point she had enough adrenaline in her system that the accounting of what had happened to her body was something she was doing at a distance, the way you do accounting when the numbers are real, but the implications haven't arrived yet. Danny was there. He was beside her with both arms around her, and she realized she was no longer holding the bed rail. "I got you," he said. "I got you, Sarah." "The patient in Bay 3, she said. "He's okay," Danny said. "He's fine. I got him. I need you to focus on me right now." "I'm focused," she said. "No, you're not," he said, and his voice broke on the second word in a way that she had never heard Danny Torres' voice break, and she registered it distantly the way you register things that are important, but that you don't have a drawer for yet. She became aware that she was no longer vertical. She was not aware of the transition, just the result. She was on the floor, and Danny was with her, and there were officers moving everywhere, and someone was calling a trauma code. And the sound of it was coming from a long way away, through what felt like water, through what felt like the specific dense silence that exists at the end of something that has been building for a long time. She thought about room 411. She thought about the green line on the monitor moving steady and regular. She thought about the photo on the rolling table, Frank's wife with her hand on his arm, looking at him instead of the camera. She thought about what he had said. That particular skill was now actively working against her. She thought about how she had said, "I need you to stop being brave for the next hour." She was trying to be honest about the pain now. She was trying to do the thing she had asked him to do. She could feel the warmth across the left side of her body and the leg that was not responding correctly, and she was being completely honest with herself about what those things meant clinically without the distance that training provides when it is someone else's body on the table. She was honest about it. She let herself be honest about it completely. The way he had told her the pain was a 7 and written it down like putting it on paper made it real enough to deal with. 7, she said out loud. Danny looked at her. "What?" "The pain," she said. "It's a 7. Danny Torres, who had 12 years in the ER and had seen things that would hollow most people out, looked at her for 1 second with an expression that contained more things than she could count. Then he pulled his hand away from her side, just enough to check what was there, and then pressed it back harder and said, "Stay with me." "I'm here," she said. "Stay with me," he said again, and his voice was doing the thing again. "Danny," she said, "I'm here." She meant it the same way she had meant every word she had said in the last 45 minutes. Completely. Without reservation. Staring straight at the truth of it without looking away. She was here. She was present. She was conscious and thinking and hurting and alive, and the ER around her was coming back to itself the way ERs always came back, organizing around the injury, redirecting toward the work. The work she thought. Rodriguez had once said she didn't have the foundation for judgment calls. She looked up at the ceiling tiles of St. Catherine's ER, the ones she had looked at 1,000 times before from an upright angle, and she thought that the foundation felt reasonably solid from where she was lying. She heard the trauma team coming. She heard the call go out for operating room 2. She heard Danny give her vitals to the incoming team in the clipped, efficient shorthand of someone who had been on this side of the handoff many times and understood that speed mattered more than completeness right now. She listened to him tell them what had happened, and she noticed that his voice had recovered entirely, that the professionalism had come back up like a second skin over the break, and she thought 12 years. That is what 12 years does. It teaches you how to hold both things at once. She thought about Frank Morrison one more time before the medication arrived and the ceiling tiles began to soften at the edges. She thought about 31 years in the Army and the commanding officer at Fort Bragg in 1971 who had decided what he thought before the evidence arrived. She thought about eventually, Eventually, the work spoke loud enough that his opinion became irrelevant. She felt the gurney under her moving. She felt the lights change overhead, the ER fluorescence giving way to the corridor giving way to the elevator giving way to whatever came next. She felt Danny's hand on her arm and heard him say something she couldn't quite hold on to. She let it go. She let all of it go for the moment because some things you have to put down before you can pick them back up properly. The doors of Operating Room 2 received Sarah Chen at 10:27 in the evening, and the people inside those doors were very good at their work, and the work began. The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Danny Torres knew this because he sat in the surgical waiting area on the third floor for every single one of those minutes and watched the clock with the specific attention of a person who has nothing useful to do and has decided that tracking time is the closest thing to control available to them. He had called Sarah's emergency contact at 10:35, which was her mother, a woman named Linda Chen, who lived in Bridgeport and who answered on the second ring and said nothing for 3 full seconds after Danny told her what had happened, and then said in a voice that was completely steady, "I'm on my way," and hung up. Linda Chen arrived at 11:20. She was 54 years old and she was wearing a coat she had clearly grabbed on the way out the door without checking which one it was, because it was a light spring jacket over what appeared to be pajama pants. And she walked through the surgical floor like none of that mattered at all, which it didn't. She found Danny in the waiting area and she sat down next to him and she said, "Tell me what happened." "All of it," he told her. All of it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat with her for a moment and then she said, "She stood between the gun and the patient." "Yes," Danny said. "That's my kid," Linda said. And then she folded her hands in her lap and she did not cry. Not then, and Danny Torres, who had been holding himself together by the same thin thread for the past hour, in 15 minutes felt something in his chest loosen very slightly at the steadiness of this woman sitting next to him in a spring jacket and pajama pants at 11:30 at night, because she reminded him precisely and completely of her daughter. What neither of them knew sitting in that waiting room was that 2 floors above them, in room 411, Frank Morrison was also awake. He had been awake since 9:47 when the lockdown alarm had activated and the unit charge nurse had come into his room with a specific kind of professional calm that Frank Morrison, who had spent 31 years learning to read professional calm, understood immediately as the performed version. Something had happened, something below. And the charge nurse was telling him to stay in bed and stay calm in the voice of someone who was managing the information she was releasing very carefully. Frank had stayed in bed. He had not stayed calm. He had the television on with the sound low, and he was watching the local news feed that had picked up the police scanner traffic, and by 10:15 he knew enough to know that there had been an armed intrusion in the St. Catherine's ER, and that at least 1 hospital staff member had been injured, and that 3 suspects were in custody. He knew that much, and he could not know more, and he lay in his hospital bed with the cardiac monitor tracing his elevated heart rate, and he thought about a 26-year-old nurse who had stayed late to check on him that afternoon, and who had said with complete conviction that her chart was solid. He thought about what he had said to her. "You caught something last night that bought me time I didn't know I was running out of." He pressed the call button. The charge nurse came in and he asked her directly by name who had been injured. She told him she didn't have that information yet. He told her he had spent 31 years in the Army, and he understood the difference between not having information and not releasing information. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone caught between protocol and decency. Then she said, "A nurse from the ER is in surgery. That's all I can tell you right now." Frank Morrison closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long time. When he opened them, he reached for the phone on the rolling table and he made a call. Not to the nurse's station, not to family in Chicago, because his family in Chicago was a niece who was good-hearted but prone to panic and would not help the situation. He called his son. His son David, who was currently stationed at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, and who was a brigadier general in the United States Army, and who answered his father's calls at any hour because Frank Morrison did not call his son in the middle of the night without a reason. "Dad," David said, and there was the instant recalibration of a man shifting from sleep to full attention. "What happened?" Frank told him. concisely with the precision of a man who had been writing military situation reports since before his son was born. He told him about Sarah Chen. He told him about the previous night, the angina, the diagnosis, the confrontation with the doctor. He told him about what the charge nurse had just said. He told him what he believed, which was that the men who had come into that ER tonight had come because of him, because of who his son was and what his son's unit did, because Frank Morrison had not been admitted to Street Catherine's hospital as a routine cardiac patient, but had been admitted under his actual name and his actual history, and somewhere between the intake desk and room 411, that information had intersected with something that wanted to use him. There was a silence on the other end that was not confusion. It was calculation. David Morrison was 39 years old, and he had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and a particular quality of stillness under pressure that the Army had trained in him, but that Frank recognized as something that had been there before the training. Nature with a good education on top. "I'll be on a plane in 2 hours," David said. "I need you to find out about the nurse first," Frank said. "Dad, find out about the nurse first," Frank said again. "Then come." Another silence. "All right," David said. "I'll make some calls. You stay where you are." "I'm not going anywhere," Frank said. "I'm attached to a cardiac monitor." "Good," David said. "David." And then with the particular shift in his voice that happened when he stopped being a general and started being a son, "You doing okay, actually." "The angina's better," Frank said. "That's not what I asked." Frank looked at the photo on the rolling table, his wife's hand on his arm, her eyes on him instead of the camera. "I'm all right," he said. "Go make your calls." He put the phone down and he looked at the ceiling and he thought about a lot of things that he did not have the right words for, which was unusual for a man who had always believed in the power of precise language. He thought about the way some people come into your life for reasons that are not apparent at the time and only become clear later when you can see the shape of what happened from a distance. He thought about his wife saying that he had spent so long being tough that he had forgotten how to be honest about being hurt. He picked up the call button again and pressed it. When the charge nurse appeared, he said, "I need you to tell whoever is with that nurse's family that Frank Morrison would like them to know she is not alone in this building tonight." The charge nurse looked at him. Something moved through her face that was not protocol and was not performed calm. She said, "I'll pass that along, Mr. Morrison." She did. Danny Torres received the message at 12:43, relayed by a floor nurse who came down to the surgical waiting area with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had been given an errand by a cardiac patient at 1 in the morning and was not entirely sure how to account for it. Danny read the note. He showed it to Linda Chen. Linda read it and held it for a moment and then handed it back to Danny and said nothing, but the way she handed it back said quite a lot. At 2:14 in the morning, the surgeon came out. His name was Dr. Abrams, and he was in his late 40s, and he had a direct, unhurried manner that told Danny within approximately 3 seconds that the news was going to be complicated but not catastrophic. Complicated but not catastrophic was, in Danny's professional experience, the best possible outcome available at 2 in the morning after a 4-hour surgery. "She's out," Dr. Abrams said. "She's stable. The shoulder injury was the most straightforward, clean in and out, no major vessel involvement, will manage with some repair to the rotator cuff and a period of recovery. The side wound is what took the time. There was internal bleeding that required attention, and we've repaired that fully. The leg injury was a fragment rather than a direct round, less significant than the others, but we needed to address it properly." He paused. "She's going to wake up in recovery in about an hour, and she is going to be in considerable pain, and she is going to need time, but she is going to be all right." Linda Chen said, "Can I see her?" Dr. Abrams said, "In about an hour." Linda nodded. She sat back down. She put both hands flat on her knees and looked at them, and Danny saw her lips move very slightly and then stop. Whatever she was saying, she had finished saying it. He sat down next to her. They sat together in the waiting area at 2 in the morning, and neither of them spoke for a while, and that was exactly correct. Rodriguez arrived at the hospital at 6:45 the next morning. He had been notified at approximately 11 the night before, when the administration had begun the process of documenting what had happened and identifying the staff members involved, and he had received the call from the chief medical officer with the particular tone of a call that is informational but is also something else, something that functions as a kind of early warning that the institutional ground is shifting. He had dressed and driven to the hospital and had been told by hospital security that the ER was a restricted area until the police cleared it, and he had gone home and tried to sleep and had not slept and had arrived back at 6:45 with the expression of a man who has been running a conversation in his head for 8 hours. The ER was still partially restricted, but the administrative offices were open, and Rodriguez went to the CMO's office and sat down across from Dr. Patricia Webb, who had been the chief medical officer at St. Catherine's for 9 years, and who had the precise, unsentimental intelligence of a person who had spent 9 years making decisions that other people would second guess and had learned to make them anyway. She stopped them from getting to the 4th floor, Webb said. She was not reading from anything. She had the facts memorized, which told Rodriguez that she had spent some portion of the night doing exactly what he had done, running it in her head, but that she had reached different conclusions. She called the cardiac unit from the nurse's station during the intrusion. She did it while 3 armed men were in the room. She then positioned herself between an armed individual and a patient in Bay 3 and remained there through 3 gunshot wounds. Rodriguez said nothing. The cardiac unit lockdown she initiated, Webb continued, is what prevented those men from reaching their intended target on the 4th floor. The police have confirmed that the lockdown, combined with the 90-second warning the cardiac unit received, is what made the difference in the outcome. She paused. The patient on the 4th floor is Frank Morrison. His son is Brigadier General David Morrison, who commands a special operations logistics unit that has apparently been involved in an active federal investigation into the men who entered this hospital last night. She folded her hands on her desk. General Morrison is on his way to Chicago. He has asked specifically to meet with the nurse who protected his father. He has also asked to meet with the hospital's senior administration. Another pause shorter. I wanted you to hear that before his arrival. Rodriguez was quiet. He was looking at the space slightly to the left of Webb's shoulder, which was where a person looks when they are processing something they did not expect to need to process. How is she? He said. She's out of surgery, Webb said. Dr. Abrams expects a full recovery with time. Good, Rodriguez said. And then after a moment, I reviewed her charting on the Morrison case yesterday morning. I know, Webb said. It was correct, he said, every step. The documentation was thorough. The clinical reasoning was sound. Webb looked at him. I know that too. I want to say that on record, Rodriguez said. I want it formally documented that her treatment of Frank Morrison in the ER was clinically appropriate and that my review confirmed that. Webb held his gaze for a moment. I'll have it noted, she said. There was nothing triumphant in her voice. Nothing that said she had been waiting for this. She was too experienced for either of those responses, and what she offered instead was the straightforward acknowledgement of a person who had no investment in making anyone feel worse than the situation already demanded. Rodriguez stood up. He had his hands at his sides, and he said, I'd like to go to the recovery unit. She's not receiving visitors yet, Webb said. I know, he said. I'd like to go when she is. Webb nodded once. He left her office. She watched the door close behind him, and she sat for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has just observed something they did not expect to observe and is deciding what to make of it. Then she picked up the phone and made the first of what would be a long series of calls. Sarah came fully awake at 7:22. She knew the recovery room the way she knew every room in this hospital, by its sounds and its light, and the specific smell of it, the antiseptic over recycled air, the soft, consistent beeping of monitors that she could read with her eyes closed. She had transported patients from here to floors, 100 times had communicated with recovery nurses about handoff protocols, had stood at the beds of people waking from surgery, and watched their consciousness come back in stages, the confusion first, and then the pain, and then the orientation, the slow return of the self to its own coordinates. She went through all of those stages herself. She noted them with a detached interest of someone conducting an observation. The confusion lasted about 40 seconds. The pain arrived at roughly the same time as the orientation, which was not ideal, but she had expected it and had already decided to be honest about it rather than manage it down to something easier to report. Her mother was there. Linda Chen was sitting in the chair beside the bed, with her coat in her lap, still the spring jacket Sarah noticed, which meant she had been here all night, and her eyes were open, and she was looking at Sarah with the precise expression she had always used when Sarah was sick as a child. Not fear, not pity, Just complete, undivided, comprehensive attention. The expression that said, I am here and I am not going anywhere, and you have my full resources, whatever those are, and whatever you need. Hi, Mom, Sarah said. Her voice was rough. Hi, baby, Linda said. How long have you been here? Well, since about 11:30, Linda said. You should have gone home. Okay, Linda said in the tone she used when she was agreeing with something she had no intention of doing. Sarah tried to take a full breath and discovered that a full breath was going to be a longer-term project. She settled for a partial breath and let it out slowly. Is everyone else okay? From the ER. Everyone else is okay, Linda said. Danny Torres sends his love. He went home about 2 hours ago when I convinced him you were stable and he needed sleep. She paused. He stayed until 2 in the morning, Sarah. He would, Sarah said. The man from upstairs sent a message. Linda said, the cardiac patient, Frank Morrison. She picked up her phone and read from it. He said to tell you that he is still here, still monitoring, and that the debt is now entirely his. Sarah closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a moment. When she opened them, she said, How is he? He had his angiogram this morning, Linda said. I asked. They said it went well. She paused. His son is apparently here. There were some men in uniform in the lobby when I went down for coffee. Sarah had been a nurse long enough to know what men in uniform in the lobby at 7 in the morning meant in the context of everything that had happened. She did not have the bandwidth to think about it fully right now. She filed it in the correct drawer and returned to the immediate. Rodriguez reviewed my charting, she said. Linda looked at her. How do you know that? Diane told me yesterday before my shift. She shifted slightly in the bed and the movement triggered a sharp report from her left side that she breathed through carefully. He was looking for something to use. And? He won't find it, Sarah said, not defiantly, just factually. Linda Chen looked at her daughter for a moment, with the particular expression of a mother who has watched someone she made become something larger than what she made them. It was not surprise. It was recognition. The recognition of a thing she had seen the seeds of for a very long time finally arrived at its full height. No, Linda agreed, he won't. The door opened and a recovery nurse came in to check vitals, and the room reorganized around the clinical, and Sarah led it. She answered questions about her pain level 7, she said still. 7, she was keeping count and cooperated with the assessment and watched the nurse's face for the micro expressions that told her what the numbers actually meant. The habit of a person who understood both sides of this particular exchange. She was still watching, still thinking, still present. 3 bullets in 4 hours on an operating table, and she was awake at 7:22 in the morning, reading the recovery nurse's face for information. Danny Torres, 2 miles away, was asleep with his phone face up on the nightstand and his shoes still on, and he would tell his wife later, when she asked why he hadn't taken his shoes off, that he had intended to and then simply hadn't had the energy for one more thing. His wife, who had been a nurse herself for 6 years before leaving to raise their children, understood this completely. At 8:15, Dr. Patricia Webb walked into Sarah's recovery room with 2 people behind her. One of them was a man in his late 30s in a military uniform, with the posture of someone who had been standing at attention long enough that it had become resting position. The other was Dr. Marcus Rodriguez. Sarah looked at Rodriguez first because he was the one she had not expected. He met her eyes and he did not look away. He looked the way people look when they have made a decision that cost them something and have decided to pay the cost anyway, which is an expression that has more dignity in it than most people would expect. Chen, he said. Dr. Rodriguez, she said. He said your charting on the Morrison case was correct. Every step. I've documented that formally. He said it cleanly without preamble, the way she had imagined he might do things if he were the doctor he was capable of being rather than the one he had chosen to be. She had always understood with the part of her that could not stop reading rooms that there was a better doctor somewhere inside Marcus Rodriguez. She had not expected to see him today. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and then he stepped back and the man in the uniform stepped forward and he said, Ms. Chen, I'm David Morrison. My father would like me to convey his personal thanks, although I expect you'll be hearing that directly from him as soon as they let him out of that unit. He had his father's jaw and a direct, unhurried quality to his speech that was unmistakably the same genetic line. I'd also like to convey something on behalf of the Department of Defense. What you did last night, the call you made to the cardiac unit, the time it bought, that had implications that go considerably beyond this hospital. I can't be specific about that right now, but I want you to know that we know exactly what happened and exactly what it cost you, and that is not something that will be treated as incidental. Sarah looked at him. She was lying in a hospital bed with extra surgical repairs and a pain level of 7, and she was still very clearly thinking. "How is your father?" she said. David Morrison looked at her for a second with an expression that was very briefly not the general but the son. "He's good," he said. "He's been asking about you since 6 this morning. They told him to rest. He told them what they could do with that suggestion." "That tracks," Sarah said. David Morrison smiled. It was his father's smile, the one that changed the whole face. "Yes," he said, "it does." Webb said, "We have some things to discuss when you're ready, Sarah. Not today, there's no rush." She said it with the careful precision of someone who meant exactly those words and not one word more. Sarah looked at the ceiling of the recovery room. She had never looked at this ceiling from this angle before for her son. It was the same tiles as the ER, the same institution, the same fluorescent hum, and it looked completely different from down here. Everything did. There was something instructive in that, she thought. The view from the floor was its own kind of information. She looked back at the people standing around her bed, her mother in the spring jacket, the CMO with her folded hands, the general with his father's jaw, the doctor who had finally done the one right thing, and she felt the weight of the last 36 hours pressing down through the mattress, and she let it press. She did not push back against it. She did not perform her way through it. She let it be exactly as heavy as it was. 7, she thought. Honest, documented, dealt with. She closed her eyes and she rested. She rested for 3 days, not because she wanted to, and not because the pain had given her a choice, but because her body had made a unilateral decision that overruled everything else the way bodies do when they have been pushed past a threshold and need to collect what they are owed. She slept in long, heavy intervals that were not entirely peaceful. There were moments inside them that she could not call dreams, exactly more like the replaying of sounds. The flat crack of the first shot, Danny's voice saying her name, the particular silence in the ER when the man in front had put his gun on the floor. But she moved through them and came out the other side each time and took inventory and found herself intact. On the second day, Danny Torres came. He brought terrible coffee from the vending machine on the second floor and handed it to her without apology, which she appreciated, and he sat in the chair her mother had occupied, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been doing his own processing for 48 hours and had arrived at something he needed to say. "You didn't have to stand up," he said. "I know," she said. "You could have stayed down with the rest of us and nobody would have blamed you." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been going over it," he said. "Every second of it. What would have happened if you hadn't made that call? If the unit hadn't locked down?" He stopped. "They had a plan for the 4th floor, Sarah. The police told me after. They had a specific plan. If those men had gotten up there, but they didn't," she said. "Because of you," he said. She shifted against the pillow and felt the left side report in with its standard update, which was still a 7 but moving intermittently toward a 6, which she was tracking with the same precision she tracked everything. "Because of the lockdown protocol," she said. "Because the cardiac unit charge nurse answered the phone and made the right call on her end. Because the officers came through the service corridor when they did. Because the man in Bay 3 didn't move when he needed to not move." She paused. "It wasn't just me." Danny looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize. "You know what your problem is," he said. "I've been told I have several. Your problem is you think giving other people credit cancels out your own." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Both things are true, Sarah. Both of them at the same time. It took a lot of people doing the right thing in the right moment, and you were the one who started it. Those two facts can exist together." She looked at him. 12 years, she thought. That is what 12 years in the ER looked like when it came out right. Not hollowed out, not bitter, just honest about the weight of things and still willing to carry them. "The coffee is terrible," she said. "It really is," Danny said. They sat with it anyway. On the 3rd day, Frank Morrison came to see her. He was in a wheelchair, which he was operating himself despite the clear preference of the orderly walking alongside him that he let someone push it, and he came through the door of a room with the expression of a man conducting an inspection he had been waiting too long to conduct. He looked at her shoulder, at the elevated arm, at the external fixation on her leg, at the careful way she was holding her left side, even lying down, and his face did something that he controlled very quickly, but not quickly enough. "You should still be upstairs," Sarah said. "They discharged me this morning," he said. "I'm being readmitted tomorrow for a follow-up procedure, and they could not give me a single medical reason why I couldn't leave the building for the 4 hours in between." He positioned the wheelchair beside her bed. "So here I am." "Here you are," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to let me finish it before you redirect it to the lockdown protocol or the charge nurse or anyone else." She pressed her lips together. "All right. What you did in that ER," he said, "was not protocol. It was not procedure. It was not the action of someone following a script or executing a plan. It was the action of someone who had already decided somewhere before the moment arrived what kind of person they were going to be when the moment arrived. And the reason I know the difference is that I spent 31 years watching people find out under pressure what they were actually made of. Most of them didn't know ahead of time. Some of them were surprised in one direction, and some of them were surprised in the other." He paused. "You were not surprised. That is a rarer thing than most people understand." Sarah held his gaze. She had promised she would let him finish. "My son told me what you said to the man who was pointing a gun at you," Frank continued. "He got it from the police report. You told him that you could not help him get to the 4th floor and that his window for walking out was closing." He paused. "You were managing him. You were buying time. You were doing all of that while standing in the open with no cover and 3 armed men in the room." Another pause, heavier. "My wife would have liked you very much." Sarah breathed carefully. The left side predictably had opinions about deep breaths. "Tell me about her," she said. Something shifted in his face that was not grief exactly, or not only grief. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a person's memory for 6 years and is not tired of it yet, and does not expect to ever be tired of it. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "She was a school teacher for 28 years, 4th grade. She used to say that 4th grade was the year children either learned that the world was worth understanding or decided it wasn't, and that she was going to make sure as many of them as possible left her classroom with the first one." He looked at his hands. "She was the smartest person I ever knew, and also the kindest, and in my experience, those two things are rarer together than separately." He looked back up. "She would have seen exactly what I saw in you on that first night. She had that instinct." "What instinct?" Sarah said. "The one for people who are going to matter," Frank said simply. She did not redirect that. She let it land. He said, "Bashamita, David wants to meet with you, formally. He's talked to the hospital administration, and they've had some conversations with the VA. There's something in the works." He held up one hand before she could speak. "I'm not going to tell you what it is because it isn't my place, and because I think you deserve to hear it without my editorial commentary attached to it." The corner of his mouth moved. "I have a lot of editorial commentary." "I've noticed," she said. "It served me reasonably well for 74 years, he said. She smiled. It was the first full smile she had managed since waking up in recovery, and it pulled at the shoulder, but she let it. "When does he want to meet?" "When you're ready," Frank said. "There's no pressure and untiming. He's a patient man. He gets it from me." He paused. "He also gets the jaw. His mother used to say we were impossible to argue with." "I believe that," Sarah said. He looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" he said. Not the clinical version of the question. Not the "how is your pain level and are you tolerating food?" The actual version. The version that was asking about the parts of a person that don't show up on charts. She thought about it honestly because he had earned the honest answer, and because anything else would have been an insult to both of them. "I'm working on it," she said. "There are some sounds that are still, I'm working on them." He nodded. "That's normal," he said. "I want you to know that. It doesn't stop being normal just because you handled it well in the moment. The body doesn't grade on a curve." "I know," she said. "I've been telling patients that for 2 years. Turns out it's different when it's you." It's always different when it's you, Frank said. That's the part they can't teach, and he stayed for 40 minutes. They talked about Chicago, about her grandmother, about the restaurant kitchen on the south side where a woman had turned 2 suitcases and a 6-month-old and 11 years of hard work into a life. He told her about Eleanor teaching 28 years of fourth graders and what it looked like at the end of each year when she came home with handmade cards from the children, how she spread them on the kitchen table and read every single one with the same attention she would have given a letter from someone important, because to her, they were letters from someone important. He told her about his first year after Eleanor died, the specific physical weight of a house that has been full of someone for 41 years and is now not the way the silence had a texture to it that he had not expected and could not describe to people who had not experienced it. She listened to all of it. She did not check her phone. She did not monitor the clock. She gave him the same thing she had given the man in Bay 3 and the 63-year-old TIA patient and the elderly man who kept asking for Gloria the 2 minutes she didn't have the full presence, the genuine attention. The thing that could not be prescribed or protocoled or performed. When he left, he put his hand briefly on the bed rail the same way he had in room 411, the gesture that was almost like he would have put it on her arm. "I'll be back tomorrow when they readmit me," he said. "If you're not sick of me by then." "I'll be here," she said. "I know you will," he said. The door closed behind him and she lay in the quiet for a while, not sleeping, just being in the room with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't needed to be said because it was already understood. David Morrison came 4 days later. He came in civilian clothes, which she understood as a deliberate choice, and he was accompanied by a woman named Dr. Renee Okafor, who was the regional director of clinical operations for the Department of Veterans Affairs and who had the focused, undecorated intelligence of someone who had been doing important work for long enough to not need it to look impressive. They sat across from Sarah, who was in a chair, now rather than a bed, which mattered to her more than she would have admitted, and David Morrison said without preamble, the way she was learning was the family way, "I want to tell you what happened, and then I want to tell you what we're thinking." What had happened was this. The 3 men who had entered St. Catherine's ER were connected to a federal investigation into theft and trafficking of classified military medical supplies, specifically a network that had been funneling controlled substances from VA distribution channels to private buyers. Frank Morrison's name had appeared in that investigation not as a target, but as a potential witness because Frank Morrison had spent 3 of his post-retirement years consulting for a VA oversight board that had flagged the original discrepancy. Someone in the network had decided that a 74-year-old cardiac patient in a Chicago hospital was a problem that could be solved. Sarah's lockdown call had given them the federal agents already surveilling the situation the 90 seconds they needed to position correctly. It had not been incidental. It had been, David Morrison said in the direct language of a man who dealt in operational outcomes, the difference. Sarah sat with that. She sat with the full weight of it the way Frank had said she was not surprised, and she let the weight be real without allowing it to become something larger than it was. It was what it was. She had done what she had done. The consequences were what they were. She did not need it to be more dramatic than the truth, because the truth was already everything. Then David Morrison told her what they were thinking. The VA's Rapid Response Medical Unit, which operated in conjunction with military installations across the Midwest, had been attempting for 2 years to add civilian medical professionals with specific skill profiles, people who could function in high-pressure, resource-limited environments, who had the instincts for pattern recognition that could not be trained from a manual, and who had demonstrated under actual conditions, rather than simulated ones, the ability to prioritize correctly when everything was happening at once. The position was not a desk job. It was not a ceremonial title. It would require additional training, a security clearance process, and a 2-year commitment to a schedule that was going to be demanding in ways that would make the St. Catherine's night shift look straightforward. Dr. Okafor laid a folder on the table beside Sarah's chair. She did not push it toward her. She put it there and left it there, which communicated something about the kind of people they were. "We're not asking you to decide today," Dr. Okafor said. "We're not asking you to decide this week. What we're asking is that you read through it and sit with it and ask us whatever questions you have, and then when you're ready to talk about it, we'll talk." Sarah looked at the folder. She did not pick it up yet. "You've talked to the hospital," she said. "We've talked to Dr. Webb," David said. She's aware. She has her own thoughts, which she said she'd share with you directly. What are her thoughts? Sarah said. David Morrison looked at her with a slight expression that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. She said you were the most clinically instinctive nurse she'd seen at St. Catherine's in a decade and that losing you would be a significant problem for the hospital. And then she said that keeping you at St. Catherine's because it was convenient for the hospital would be exactly the kind of institutional thinking that the hospital needed to examine itself about. He paused. She said it more diplomatically than that. I'm summarizing. That's her, Sarah said. Dr. Okafor said the veterans we serve need people who understand them. Not just medically, the whole person. The history, the weight they carry, the particular way people who have been through certain things learn to underreport their own pain. She paused deliberately. You got a 74-year-old combat veteran to tell you his pain was a 7 within 20 minutes of meeting him. Do you understand how rare that is? Sarah thought about Frank's voice saying 7, and the way he had said write that down like putting it on paper was the only way to make it real. He was ready to be honest, she said. I just asked the right way. That is the entire job, Dr. Okafor said, knowing how to ask the right way. Sarah picked up the folder. She did not read it there. She set it in her lap and she looked at David Morrison and she said, your father is going to be all right. It was not a question. She had seen the results of his follow-up procedure and she had read the notes the way she always read notes, not as a document, but as a story with a clinical arc, and the arc was good. He was 74 years old with managed cardiac disease and a stent that was doing its job, and a son who was going to spend the next several months finding reasons to come to Chicago. He was going to be all right. David Morrison looked at her, and the general was entirely gone for a moment, and what was there was simply a man whose father had come very close to something that David could not let himself think about too directly. Yeah, he said, he is. Good, she said, then everything else is workable. Rodriguez came to see her the day before she was discharged. She had not expected it. She had processed his statement at her bedside in recovery, had filed it in the correct drawer, had moved past it in the way you move past something once it has been named and does not require further examination. But he knocked on the door of her room on a Thursday afternoon and came in without the particular energy he always carried in the hospital, the forward-leaning purposefulness of a man who needed everyone to understand he was the most important person in any given room. He came in without that, and he stood near the door, and he said, I won't stay long. It's fine, she said. He looked around the room without really seeing it the way people look when they need a moment to organize what they came to say. Then he looked at her. I've been asking myself for the last week why I did what I did. Not the specific incidents, the pattern of it, why I kept going after you specifically. He stopped. I don't have a satisfying answer. I've been in this hospital for 4 years, and I have operated a certain way, and it worked, and nobody told me it wasn't working, which I understand now is not the same thing as it working. He paused. That's not an excuse. No, she said, it's not. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to accept an apology or to tell me it's fine or to make this easier for me. I'm here because I needed to say it directly to you and not into a formal review or an HR file. He met her eyes. You were right about that patient. You were right about every clinical call you made in my ER, and I made your work harder, and I made you doubt yourself, and then you stood in front of a gun and kept someone alive, and I have been sitting with that for 8 days. The room was quiet. Sarah looked at him. She thought about the 26-year-old woman who had stood at the supply station after he took the chart from her hands and pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and gone back to work. She thought about the hesitation she had developed, the half-second pause, the breath she hadn't needed before he taught her to need it. She thought about all of it, and she felt it fully, and she did not minimize it, and she did not perform her way through it. I hear you, she said. I'm not going to tell you it's fine because it wasn't fine and it isn't fine yet. But I hear you. He nodded once. He turned toward the door. She said, Rodriguez. He stopped. The reason you singled me out, she said. 8 months ago, I corrected a medication order in front of people. You know that's what it was. He was still facing the door. His back did not move. Then it moved just slightly, a single breath. Yes, he said. I know. That patient had a documented penicillin allergy, she said. I want that on the record too. He turned and looked at her one more time. His face had the expression of a man fully paying the cost of something and finding in the paying that it was the right price. It's on the record, he said. He left. She sat with the quiet for a while after that, with the folder in her lap and the gray Chicago light coming through the window and the sound of the hospital moving around her orderlies in the corridor, a monitor somewhere down the hall, the distant percussion of a service elevator opening and closing. She knew these sounds. She had spent 14 months learning them from the inside of the ER, and now she was learning them from the outside, from the patient's side, and they sounded different from here. Everything did. The view from the floor was its own kind of information. She opened the folder. She read it slowly with the same precision she brought to everything she read clinically, looking not just at what was on the page, but at what the page implied the shape of the work. It was describing the kind of days it would make, the kind of people she would be doing it with and for. She read about the training program. She read about the security clearance timeline. She read about the specific veteran populations the unit served, the ones who had come home carrying the things the medical system had not been designed to hold, the ones who had been through experiences that made them underreport a pain level of 7 as a 4, the ones who needed someone who knew how to ask the right way. She thought about Frank Morrison on that first night, holding his left arm close to his body in a way that he probably thought looked casual. She thought about Eleanor laying 28 years of handmade cards on the kitchen table and reading every single one with the same attention she would have given a letter from someone important. She thought about her grandmother, 2 suitcases, and a 6-month-old, and 11 years, and the things she had told Sarah at 10 years old about people who tried to make you feel small. She turned the last page. She picked up her phone and she called David Morrison's number, which he had left on the folder. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Alberto, I have questions." He said, "I expected that." She said, "A lot of questions." He said, "I have time." She asked them, all of them. She asked about the training timeline and the on-call structure and the scope of practice and the relationship between the civilian and military components of the unit and what happened to her existing nursing license and certifications during the transition period, and a dozen other things that she had identified on her first read as requiring answers before she could make a decision that was real rather than emotional. He answered each one directly without spin, without the salesmanship she had been slightly braced for, and twice he said he did not know the answer and would find out, which raised her opinion of him considerably. At the end, she said, "Give me 1 more week." He said, "Take 2. She said, "1 is enough." He was quiet for a moment. She heard something in the silence that might have been his father's smile from a room away. "All right," he said, 1 week. She put the phone down. She looked at the folder. She looked at her hands, still marked with the faint traces of medical tape from the IV line they had removed that morning, the hands that had started drips and run EKGs and written down a pain level of 7 because a man had trusted her enough to be honest about it. She looked at her hands and she thought about all the rooms they had worked in and all the rooms that were waiting, the ones she had not been to yet, the ones where someone was going to be holding their left arm close to their body in a way that they probably thought looked casual. She set the folder on the table beside her bed with the same deliberateness that Dr. Okafor had set it beside her chair, which was the deliberateness of someone who knows that what they are putting down is not being put down for good. She had 1 week. She was going to use every hour of it. Danny Torres called that evening, as she had known he would, because Danny Torres had 12 years in the ER and a wife who had been a nurse and 2 kids whose names Sarah knew, and a laugh that belonged in a larger room, and he had been checking on her every evening since the night they had sat together at 2 a.m. and not needed to speak. She picked up on the first ring. "How are you?" he said. 6, she said, moving toward 5. She heard him breathe out, the slow, complete exhale of a person releasing something they had been holding for 10 days. "Good," he said. "That's good, Sarah." "Danny," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for staying." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't thank me for that. That's not something you thank someone for." "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He laughed, and it was the real laugh, the one that belonged in a larger room, and she held the phone and let it be there with her. In the quiet, that laugh, that proof that the people worth keeping could still laugh after everything that 12 years in did not have to hollow you out if you were made of the right material and chose the right work and showed up every night and kept your hands moving and your head clear and your eyes open. Sarah Chen was discharged from St. Catherine's Hospital on a Friday morning with a left arm in a sling, a leg that was going to need 6 more weeks of careful management. 3 scars she had already decided to consider credentials in a folder on her kitchen table that she had read 4 times and was going to read once more before she made the call. She had already made the call. She just needed to read it one more time to be sure she was making it for the right reasons. And when she read it that last time, she found that she was, and she picked up the phone and she did not hesitate at all.